those are some items I wanted to start us with. Okay, Jeff.
I wanted to add, I think I
This,
should figure this out.
this is Jeff's first time up here, so forgive his nervousness and not knowing what to do with his microphone.
I was thinking what you were sharing, and Gabe on your sharing. Is Gabe still here? He had to leave, didn't he? Yeah. It's not a normal thing to, Gabe's in the church that meets in our house. And it's not a normal thing for somebody who's an artist, and he's a well-known artist in the community, to be willing to go through a process of having his lyrics discussed by a church. Artists aren't really known. When you get an artist that's producing a song or something like that, it's kind of like everything becomes sacred and they don't want anybody touching it, and so we've gotten a good habit going where we're teaching and some really important stuff, and like the encyclicals, and Gabe gets stirred, and as he's learning starts putting a song together, and he'll tell us it's forming, and it'll be 3-4 times before 3-4 Sunday nights before he actually puts it out there for the first time, and then all of us know you don't critique the music, all right? Don't touch. That's all in a matter of preference. But the idea of getting the words correct, that last one, Body of Life, you actually can see, beginning with the meal, the symposium, and it's very, very well put together from 1 Corinthians 11:17 to 14:40. And that's the kind of thing that has to happen if we got musicians that are putting music together, that they're willing to go through that, willing to kind of go through that process. So he'll put his screen on, he'll put his new lyrics up on our TV, and our whole church is there, and people will freely say, "What do you mean by this?" And it's really become a natural process. But so he touched on it, and you were building on it, Michael. But it's kind of a way of thinking that we need to build in for these things to have the level of impact that they need to have if they're going to rise above a given church or a cluster.
So music carries the paradigm. I forget your name. Antonio? No, not Antonio. Arturo. You were talking about short films. We got art pieces. All those things carry the paradigm with them, and so they have to go through a process where they're edified. That's a very, very important process for all of us. We have to be creating those artifacts in our own day to own them. A lot of just showing up and singing a hymn that's fighting a 500-year-old battle is not quite the deep and depth roots that we're looking for as a modern church today. Okay, so we are doing session 3 today. Do we have anything else before we move into session 3?
What's that?
We have anything else before we go into session 3? Are you ready to move into session 3?
Am I what?
Are you ready? Are you ready?
I'm mixed.
You're mixed.
Yeah. Oh, I'm ready.
Oh, okay.
There's no problem there.
So what are you mixed about?
Am I ready? Am I confident that I can hit the stuff that I need to hit to bring everybody along, because there's so much.
Yeah.
So I have trepidation. Is that a word? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I have intrepidation, whatever that is. I think about whether we can accomplish that.
Well, I was thinking about that some, reflecting on that, and I heard from some of you and then talked to some of the team as well over the last 12 hours. But picture the S-curves. One way to help you, a couple just thoughts here to help you frame it in. We're giving you something that I think is a framework that I'll be working with for my next 40 years. So you're getting a big framework pieces. So just think about it, be patient with yourself. Be patient with yourself. If you can walk away with 2 or 3 things, that's good. That's good. I know we all want to know and learn everything, but you're not going to be able to eat the whole elephant at one time. So just know that this is framework pieces. Know that these will be ongoing dialogues for us. The other thing related to that I was thinking about was just picture yourself on these S curves and your leadership team on these S curves, and picture your church networks on these S curves. And you can be at different spots. Because I've noticed with some of you, you can be here on the second curve in your understanding, but the reality of your situation is over here on the first curve maybe. And that's okay, because we always need to be a step ahead or 2 steps ahead in our development as well. So that's okay. Be okay with that. There's you should have some discontentment with that always, but be okay with that. We need to wrestle with one another and provoke one another up these curves, and wrestle up these curves together. But I think another thing just to say is we've been wrestling with this for 10 years here in our own setting. And you will have opportunity. We'll give you a little more windows today than we did yesterday, is the plan, for you to wrestle with this on your own. You've got to, at some point in your lives, in your leaders' lives, and in all the believers' lives, you've got to make it your own. So this is session 3. This is session 4. This is session 5 that we're going to do tomorrow. This is session 5, blown up, the core piece of it. So you have to give yourself time and wrestle with these things, and you'll make them your own. Do your own body of work in these as time goes on too. So we're giving you the framework pieces now, and so just make sure you can 2 or 3 things of this framework that you can put the corner pieces in. I know I always want to put the whole puzzle together right away, but put the corner pieces in the puzzle. Those are some reflections, because I know some of you can feel like, oh my goodness, this feels like everything is brand new. And that's a good feeling, but it can be a little disorienting as well, especially if we're going to add more on top of you the next 2 days. Follow up on that, Jeff, or comments or questions to that orientation, Steve, or any of the other coaches want to add anything to that to help people be able to? What's that?
Totally agree. It takes time.
Takes time. 32 years.
A couple other things to keep in mind before we start here too. A lot of you that were here last year got the 1.0, the beta ones of the 13 books. Now we've got it to, the guys have developed a whole system. Nancy takes it through actually 4 levels of audit, and then several others touch on the other side. So we've got them at that level now. But we don't have, these are just mock-ups, but you'll have the early, middle, later letters where you can get them in slipcases. And so they're all done. They're all at the top level, and we can begin translation in a lot of places. But we did it like this so that you can treat this as not just 13 booklets hanging around on your shelf, scattered everywhere, but you're building your body of work. That's the idea behind it. So this is something just like the leadership series originally, you're going to cycle through many times as you do your work. And obviously, Michael's developed a nice filing system for him to keep increasing his own work, and all of you need to do that. But still, if you, when you're sitting around eyeball to eyeball and everybody's got their notebooks, you want your 1.0 collection and then do it again and start over and get a second one of these and do 2.0 and keep building your work, because you're going to use it. It's all designed to use it in conversation in training leaders, and establishing churches. And it's a lot of work, but it's doable. Now, so if you want a couple examples, Michael has taken, I think we should put the 13 booklets loose, just one set up here, so along with the books you can flip through. But Michael's taught with his global team, 2 Corinthians and 2 Timothy. Bill's taught all of Series 3 with his church before he was involved in starting a new church, including the 7 grandmothers. And Renton and his wife have translated a vast majority of this already. And for 2 years, we've gone from Mark to 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and then 2 Timothy. And we've done this spending 2 times, once every other week for 3.5 hours, 2 times for each session across those 4. And so the impact, he can also, because we're flying at 10,000 feet and dropping down to 3,000 feet, but on the ground it's the booklets, and so if you want to look at them or get a hold of Bill, get a hold of Renton, it's pretty hard to catch us, but to get a feel for it if you're not familiar. I mean, it's the same format as First Principles, so you know the method, but it's a lot deeper dive. First Principles are usually 75 pages. These are 175, sometimes more. In fact, the whole set is 2,400 pages just on Paul's early, middle, and later letters. So they're booklets, but they're doable, but, you got to decide to really work at it. Michael's setting the example off of this, but anyway. But anyway, these will be available in the near future. And many of you are just involved in translating electronically and moving them around. But I think more and more as you develop the capacities in this, the print versions are going to probably be pretty important.
Yeah, so just again, another orientation piece. This is the early letters. This is the middle letters. This is the later letters. And just imagine right beside this, the Petrine circle letters. Yeah, show it visually too.
So there'll be a slip.
So
here is, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so you got Paul's corpus here. You got the Petrine circle here, right next to it, and then you have the Johannine literature right here. So you have the whole New Testament. Yikesy. You have the whole New Testament right here, and then when you go into Paul's corpus, you've got the early, middle, and later. And the thing I wanted to point out to you then is that this is what we keep saying to you, but this is a tool that tells you how to interact with the whole piece, the whole corpus, the whole 27 letters. And inside of these, we have summary booklets. So there's a whole booklet, one booklet in here that's just called Paul's Early Letters and just summarizes a summary piece for Paul's early letters. Same for the middle, same for the later. And so there's an additional book in there. And then in the gospel books, there's one that the gospel books themselves are inserted into their proper place into the corpus here, but there's also an additional summary book on Jesus to the Gospels, from Jesus' life to the 35 years later when the gospel books themselves were already written, when most of this body of literature was already assumed and knew by the churches. We tend to teach Matthew 28 or Matthew 16 or the book of John to brand new believers, not understanding the way it was used originally was they already had received most of these letters already. So
give me that back.
We're giving you today, and the next 3 days, we're giving you how to get through the whole New Testament corpus with this. That's why we keep saying we're giving you a lot. We're flying pretty high, but I hope you can
And see, the
put that into the
importance of
piece.
this, is when you're looking on the spine, you got Paul's early or later letters, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, but then here is from Jesus to the Gospels and Luke Acts. So they're bound in here. So our canonical section, our second session from yesterday, is basically the whole logic behind the integration of Paul's letters and the centrality of it and how it integrates then and situates the Gospels. So when you get the orange one, which will be in a slipcase, you will have Mark and Matthew in it. And again, put in the order that they were both written and how they built on each other. So it gives you the capacity to think in sections. And then there'll be one for John, and you can see the second one in, it's Johannine, the second one in is John. And then we designed the glossary, because we're not going to do those whole sessions, but we designed the glossary of these statements, and you'll look at them today, topos-based topic statements, and how that we put those in a collection. So they're all in one glossary, so you can look them up. But they're we were talking about a new lexicon, new word definitions, but it's also a collection of new ideas. I mean, they're embedded there, but they're new ideas. So it seems like it's redundant, but when you're in here, you've got in the book, the big one this one that we're looking at, you've got a collection of Paul's early letters, those terms, middle letters, those terms, later letter, those terms. And then you got the gospel letters to him. So when you're thinking through those sections, you can actually go in and just think the vocabulary, the main ideas that are developing in that section, but then they're all integrated into a final lexicon. And it seems like waste, but you have to think in canonical sections to get down to the meaning of books, all the way down to the...
You gotta look at the whole forest, the whole 27 letters, before you can begin to understand how to use 1 Corinthians 13 in a wedding. That's always my go-to one, because it's that 1 Corinthians 13 is in the gathering portion, how you're supposed to gather to propagate the kerygma. Let's go one step further. In each of these books, Jeff, while we're running down this road, we're going to go one more.
These are my books.
One more kilometer. Yeah, I don't know where I put my books. They got lost from yesterday morning till this morning, but maybe they're in my bag right there. Each of these books is organized by the author's intent and then the design of the book, the literary design, the way the author's arguments unfold. And so each session then is from that literary design. So then what we've done in here is made, and we're going to talk more about this, but we're going to have you actually use this today. But just want you to know then each literary section from the author then is found as an assessment question in this book. Are you following? You see the whole forest here. Now you can start seeing the individual clusters of trees. There's 3 big clusters, Paul, Peter's, John's. Now you can start going into each cluster and look at each of the, maybe those are 3 hubs, and then you can look at the clusters, and now you can start going into each of the literary sections and start making an assessment and making benchmarks for how we are to establish churches. And that's what this guide is. So if you go through this whole guide, you're basically, at some point here, we just have the Pauline corpus in here now and the story, and then the gospel books are in here. But at some point then we're going to be adding the Petrine and Johannine to this. So you'll be able to go through here and have the whole entire New Testament and the author's intent and their design, and be able to use that to build up the second curve. And so you'll be able to mark it and say we're weak here. And if you're weak there, then you can go in to this portion and see, okay, if we're weak there, this is how we need to get stronger roots, is in this section right here. You follow? So we're just trying to orientate you again about the pieces we're going to go through in section 3 and 4 today, about where they fit in this big framework. Okay, that was a long
You know,
introduction.
you ultimately have to ask the question why. I mean, I know we sound like salesmen, but we don't make any money,
we
so we're
sound,
not
we
very
sound
good.
like what?
As you put them in, what's that?
We sound like what?
Salesmen.
Salesmen?
Yeah.
Gee whiz.
But what I'm saying
Horrible.
is that that's not what we're doing. Well, we're selling, but I mean, that's not what we're doing. We're saying, because we don't, I mean, these are going to go free into your network, so we don't make anything off them, so keep that in mind. But there is not anything that exists that does this. And the reason why I say that is, and you have to say why, the 32 courses that really have been reduced down, it's actually it's the 25 on the leadership series, took a year per course, working it out here. This took us a decade. Why? Because you can't do the paradigm without mastering Paul's processes. You can't do it. You can't
It's a huge
succeed.
statement.
And so I hope when you see, I'm going to take a little time in, well, I think it's the Galatians one in here, in this session. I'm going to take a little time to read a couple of those statements that are evaluation statements. They're not just questions. You know, they're the ideas, and then that you have to establish your people and your leaders and your churches in. And books like Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians are the processes of doing it. So there's not anything that you will find anywhere that will start from the eyes of Paul and what he was doing in establishing the network, and then the eyes of Peter, and then the eyes of John, and why they were doing what they're doing, and how they went about doing it, and what are the core concepts within it. So our passion in this is, it's very difficult. People are excited about the encyclicals. They're excited about the first principles. And we're seeing already that it's difficult to get people to another level and to be excited about what's here. So that's part of what we're after, because you can't really establish your networks unless you've mastered Paul's early, middle, and later letters. You can't do it. And the first principles don't get you there. The first principles are cycle 1 and cycle 2. This is cycle 3. So that's kind of why we're devoting so much time to this, because most of you are in a position now where numbers of networks all around the world are going to say yes to this 10-year plan. And the first 5 years, you have to build your networks. You have to build a complex apostolic team, multi-level. You've got to have hubs and strategic elders in place. And you've got to have a lot of grassroots training, and you've got to have church gatherings that are able to begin with that gathering and have the capacity to multiply. And so Paul, that's why we have the letters and the situational form that we do, to be able to, you can plug that into your networks and know what you're doing if you really pay the price for it. So that's our motivation behind this right now, is in the front end of these commitments of 10 years that you're going to build the whole paradigm with us in your network and double it in the second 5 years. In the midst of that, we have to convince you to really begin investing your own development by going
That's
through
right.
this process.
That's right. You've got to tie yourself to Paul's traditioning process that Christ gave him.
Shall we do it?
Yep.
All right. And also the other thing that I did is in your glossary, in your annotated library, all the really important stuff in the last 40 years that's been developed out of the Greco-Roman world. And most of it is not evangelical. Most of it comes out of those that are going back searching for the historical Paul, the historical church. And there's departments like Baylor, the Stark's department that do research in universities where a lot of this stuff is coming from, as well as a collection of scholars here, a collection of scholars in the Scandinavian area, and the collection of scholars in Australia, have traces. So I'm introducing you to the whole body of work But at the beginning is about 8 key tools that open up the door to endless topics to follow this. And so those are all up here. And the latter part of the time, I'll introduce you to them. And they're all available electronically. So we're trying to make sure that everything that we do is available electronically at this stage. Okay. Boy, what a long introduction. Okay, this is the outline. I'm not going to do any of this because we'll do it piece by piece. Here's the appendix I was talking to you about, the comprehensive assessment tool that Michael was talking about, the annotated library, and the key terms and concepts by collection, canonical collection, and then together as a whole. Now, yesterday we looked at the new perspective on Paul, rethinking Western hermeneutics. And clear back to Kaiser's quote, I think it was 82, the one out of Concordia. The changes that have to come in hermeneutics are changes at the level of the changes that happened in the Reformation. And that's by what I would consider one of the best Old Testament biblical theology scholars anywhere, and was quick to discover a new pathway. We looked at the new perspective on Paul, the modern search for the historical Paul, a new hermeneutic, Paul a coherent thinker, huge implications, apostolic traditioning from schema to principles to processes to practice. And we'll tell you what we're going to tell you, then we'll tell it again, what we told you. But this is a very important phrase here, apostolic traditioning, from schema to principles to processes to practice. And so that concept begins to get into your head, if you structure your church network around the way of Christ and the apostles, and you're building an apostolic team and laying all those foundations, you're solving problems that come up while you're stabilizing it, you're training senior elders in some of the key places, your grassroots with all your people, you can still make a huge mistake. And a huge mistake is to put together ministries on the old paradigm in the context of your church. You could still put together, where most of evangelicalism is going, a psychological care paradigm rather than a pastoral care paradigm for counseling in your churches. There's all kinds of things, and people will pump money and everything in to get you to do that. You've got to rethink all of your ministries, like the counseling ministry in your church. You've got to rethink all of them, starting with Paul's schema, moving to principles, moving to processes and practices. And you can't take what's out there. And I'll illustrate that before we're done on our counseling, shepherding counseling paradigm, which will be one of the development tools that you'll get next year. And then topoi as clustering. In other words, you have these complex topics like the gathering, and he's accomplishing smaller ideas within the gathering that he also develops other places. But the ideas are subordinate to the gathering piece that he's talking about. And then little asides about that in his letters. So all this is built in. You'll automatically do this if you seriously go through these booklets. This whole process is built in. Now, we looked at the hermeneutics, core hermeneutical overarching concepts. Everything we've done is originally built around a new encyclopedia, Biblical Theology Replaces Systematic, a hermeneutical process of author's intent, literary design, and biblical theology. And you're actually going to see today that literary design, if you put it in the canonical sections of his early, middle, and later letters, you're actually going to see that the literary design gives you the benchmarks. So you can look at one time and see the benchmarks of whether your churches are getting established correctly. And then hermeneutically trained judgment. It's not a mechanical process by one individual professional trained scientist that's like a professor preaching Sunday in and out, but instead it's an integrated hermeneutical process that keeps going cyclically to get clearer and clearer, and then you learn to do that in community. So your apostolic team, your top eldership team can all think hermeneutically together on complex problems that come to your churches. And then the second is the next collection that really works on, out of the new perspective on Paul, original Paul, that really works on, now let's see this not only from the overarching concepts, but recognize that now we're going to take hermeneutics out of the seminary and we're going to put it in the church, and you're actually going to look at the process of establishing the churches through the eyes of Paul, then the eyes of Peter, and then the eyes of John. That's very different. And this enables you to do that. The new perspective on Paul. Next year, when we look at it, it'll be the new perspective on Peter. Again, a whole body of literature, and we've just finished those Petrine Circle letters, but they go through this editing process now. New perspective on Paul, a coherent thinker establishing churches. Then the topos, not just simply topics that are isolated from each other, but the overarching, the subsections, and the sides that build through that. The traditioning process of from schema to principles to processes to practices. And no theology of Paul. Once you learn how to do that and you develop a shepherding counseling ministry, you got to write something on it. You got to put it together and explain how it fits. And so there's all kinds of things that are going to be written. But you keep it active and alive. You don't build it all into a textbook, a biblical theology textbook per se. Okay, now, then we looked at the canonical section in session 2, and these are the letters of Paul, the 49 to 67. This is all how they unfolded, and we're clear down to here. We just got the Johannine left for this year, and then the New Testament is complete. And we have the Old Testament design too, by the way. And so here, keep in mind that the basic concept is you start with the first principles. And this is the first principles of actually interpreting and sketching across Acts and the Pauline letters. And then the concept moves to mastering the scriptures, which again is what Paul said to Timothy, that you now have become a master craftsman. So we're working with the ideas that are actually there and the terminology that's actually there. Now here, the schema framework of Paul's letters, the Greek rhetorical schematic of topos and topoi, and then schematic codifying work for establishing churches, apostolic traditioning of Paul today, and then how you actually go from schema to principles, process to practices. Now, this is a tough section. It's very, very relevant, but it's a tough section. And all I have to do, I should have just skipped reading that, because who wants to know about the schema of Paul's letters, the Greek rhetorical, schematic, topos, topoi? You know, there's not one single normal word outside of Greek in that one. Schematic codifying framework for establishing churches, and the traditioning. So, I mean, this is a big part of the engine, but hopefully we'll be reasonably successful in getting it across. I want to begin with the topos-based topic statement of the apostolic traditioning of Paul listed in the glossary. So, now this is an example. The glossary is filled, I don't know what it'll be, but it'll probably be about 150 of these kind of statements. Now, what the heck is that statement? Because these also turn into questions. And so it's not a short question. And so what is this statement? The apostolic traditioning of Paul. Well, it's there in your glossary because you got to keep going back in your head to get the idea right. What do we mean by that? And it was a concept that clear up to Tertullian in the year 200 understood that churches were established in the apostolic paradigm, the Antiochian tradition, by this traditioning process of Paul. This is a phrase that refers to Paul's process of establishing churches that sets Pauline corpus tradition to be handed down to all future churches. That this was a unique part of his apostolic stewardship of revealing Christ's grand strategy regardless of history, time, and culture, a process that includes following Paul's schema, principles, processes, and practices. So, in other words, you can't just take the psychological care paradigm of counseling in the West today and plug it into the church, the Christian psychological care paradigm. Or you're going to smash apart the model not the model, but the process that you're building in your network. A simple example is who's responsible in the shepherding and counseling for overseeing the churches and helping people get the help that they need. It's the elders. But when you go into the psychological care, Christian psychological care paradigm, you send them outside the church to a Christian counselor who they can speak confidentially with and keep all the information away from the eldership that are shipping them. That's the engine of the paradigm. That's just one piece that gets screwed up. So you've got to learn to do this. After we get everything established, you have to take the apostolic tradition of Paul and shape your ministries, your ministry strategies that way, and not adapt the ones that are in the world around. So this changes the game everywhere. Now, how do you get this idea? Where does this come from? Well, let's look at how Paul explains it. What did I do? Okay. How do we know this is correct understanding since it is such an all-encompassing idea? Well, Paul uses the term tradition in two key passages. He says in 1 Corinthians, the whole idea is 1 Corinthians 2:17 and 23. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I handed them on to you. Now, in the following instructions, I do not commend you because you have come together not for the better but for the worse. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you. Now, the system that is attacking Paul is the secondary tradition built from the Old Testament of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees and the Pharisees? That's a new level of dyslexia. I took the front end of one word and put it on the other and flipped it. Not everybody has that skill. Look at what he's saying here. See, the Judaizing system that's out there that was attacking the churches has created a secondary tradition of all these rules and regulations and destroyed basically the whole spirit and intention of the Old Covenant and the law. And so now Paul's saying, okay, I'm giving you traditions. Well, what does the word tradition mean? It's the authority. Imagine I defined it. No, wait a minute. Okay, it means the authoritative handing down, passing down. And that's exactly what he said when he's talking about this. I received from the Lord, which I also handed on to you. So there's authoritative tradition that Paul received from the Lord that he's handing down to you, that he's already handed down to them, that he's reinforcing right now. In 2 Thessalonians, he says, now we command you, beloved, in the name of Jesus, to keep away from believers who are living in idleness and not according to the tradition which they receive from us. Take note of those who do not obey what we say in this letter, have nothing to do with them, so that they may be ashamed. Do not regard them as enemies, but warn them as believers. Okay, now he uses tradition again, which is the authoritative teaching, who do not obey what we say in this letter. So how did Paul view his letters? He viewed them as authoritative teaching that was handed to him from Christ, that he's handing down to the churches, and he states all the churches are to follow this. And so, we're not piling up theology, so we've got, so that means that you'll see all of his letters, he uses different terms for it, but all of his letters are taking what he received and now delivering it to the churches and also challenging the churches to stay within it. And shows the processes. he did to stabilize them. Now, I appeal to you, Paul and his churches, and his way in Christ is in every church. I appeal to you then, be imitators of me. For this reason I sent Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child, to remind you of my ways in Christ Jesus, as I teach them everywhere in every church. Very significant statement. That's earlier in Thessalonians. So there's ways, and actually when you get carefully into 1 Corinthians 4 through 8 particularly, Paul uses the phrase differently. He says, these are the ways that I'm practicing that I got handed down from Jesus. But sometimes he would say something like, well, I say this because it's from Jesus. And other times he'll say, I'm saying this, I think that's what we should be doing. And other times he'll say, I say this is my opinion, when he's helping solve a problem. So there's a flexibility within the solidness of the authoritative teaching that was handed down to him. And when you say, imitate Paul, my ways in Christ, who was Paul? He was chosen to reveal Christ's grand strategy for his churches. And so imitate Paul, my ways in Christ. So he's talking about the way of Christ and the apostles. And Paul stewards the tradition for every church. Now, take this way. Michael was touching on it a little bit yesterday. Sunni religion is a way, and it's more than just the doctrine. It's the way of living. And then when we just went through Hebrews, and Hebrews uses the concept of paradigm, and he talks about the way, essentially the new and living way of the new covenant. And it replaces the way of the old covenant. And so when we're talking about learning the new covenant, and when we enter into the new covenant, which is why the gathering is so central in the meal, because it anchors the churches week by week, the fact that you're entering into the new covenant. You're not just entering into sound doctrine, you're entering into a way of living. One of the reasons why the first principles are so different than foundational studies is foundational studies are organizing the ideas. The first principles are coming from the perspective of you're entering into a way, a new way of living. And that way of living, together with that sound teaching that's handed down, is also the way of establishing churches and putting together inside Christ's grand strategy the framework that we see in Acts. And when you actually go back to Acts, what's interesting is they were called the way early on in Acts when they shifted into the Gentile. They called them the way. So the way is such an important concept. And so I think we're exactly accurate when we talk about the way of Christ and his apostles. Because it's not just the doctrine of Christ and his apostles, it's the way. And you can't enter into that way and enter your churches into that way without starting with these foundational letters and for the intention that they were originally used. And with it, you will find an integrated way, so if you master them, you'll have the acumen, which is also called the mind of Christ. Now, how do we know this is correct, a correct understanding? Same question. Paul uses the term tradition. They represent authoritative teachings handed down. All churches are to follow them. They include processes and practices like the gathering supper and the paranetic moral instructions like virtue, vice, clusters, and the household text. Paul received them from Christ himself. That was part of Paul's job description to reveal Christ's grand strategy and design for his churches. Paul stewards the apostolic teaching. And you'll see with Peter and the Petrine circle and with John, it adds greater and greater clarity, but this is the foundation. Now, let's look at these statements for a moment. So Paul's traditions, overarching topos, schemas, principles, processes, practices, are in his letters to his churches and his key young emerging apostles. Remember our definition. Topos, again, this is in your glossary, are common topics in one place. It is a very important form of Greek rhetoric that enables one to structure an argument that includes several topics around one memorable schematic or rubric, literally in one place or topoi. So the statements these are often long statements or short paragraphs that summarize a key concept using the form of Greek rhetoric of the day. It is sort of a topic, but it's not an isolated topic. It's a topic related to an organizing center. So the household structure, social structure of Paul's letters is an organizing center of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Therefore, the rest of the particulars cannot be fully understood independent of the organizing center. The topos-based topic statements must very much relate to the new perspective of Paul and the hermeneutic of Paul being a coherent thinker. Now, we turn to Paul's letters, and I'm going to put a framework together, just a handful of slides, a framework together that actually gives you the ability to create a window across all these letters and see all the benchmarks that are there so you can instantly, in one visual, do some basic assessment of benchmarks that haven't been reached within your network of churches. Now, we're going to break it down so you can get into the detail of the solutions, but you got to have two big snapshots. The first big snapshot is basically the framework, or the schema, and the second one is going to relate to the benchmarks of the literary design, or another way of saying it is the intention and the literary design. Now, most of you have seen this, but Paul's letters are tools in the process of building strong churches. So Paul's traditioning process, the schematic for setting church networks in order, is listed here. His early letters, he first of all has to get them established in the gospel. Yes, he's doing some didache work in it, but if they're not stabilized and established in the gospel, then everything's going to go the wrong direction. And so the early letters, Galatians, why have you so quickly diverted for another gospel? 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you embrace the gospel fully. Here's how we stabilize you in that. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, all these schisms are a result of not understanding the gospel well. And on top of that, these leaders that are shaping the schisms reject me as an apostle who is bringing you this gospel and getting you established in it. And then Romans is the final great treatise of the gospel. And when he finishes, now he says, and this is one of Paul's favorite words, now I have established you in my gospel, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. I've rooted you in my gospel. And again, that takes us back to the, in fact, you really could say all of Paul's early letters are actually building, those 6 letters are building deep roots that stabilize them in the gospel. They got the gospel from Peter, even in his 5 sermons, but his short sermon in Cornelius, and you get the core of that gospel statement. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-6, Paul says, I got the core of that gospel statement and it was checked out back with the Jewish leaders. But his letters now take and fully understand and root those churches, including what are the battles that you have to fight, of which Paul is regarded as very, very strong. So the first is to get them strong in the gospel, then strong in the mission and vision of the church, and the organizing center is Ephesians 3, 8-10. Paul's got a twofold job description: to preach the gospel to the Gentiles and to bring to light what is the plan, the grand strategy. And Ephesians gives that in manifesto form. Right around Colossians does the same thing, only applying it to the cluster of churches in the Lycus Valley, Colossae, Hierapolis, and Laodicea. Then you've also got Philippians, which is a very key church in showing how they're participating with Paul in this progress of the gospel. So now we understand that the vision of the church, Christ's vision of the church, is to sit at the very center of his overall plan, and Paul's the one that's to bring that to light. But then you have his later letters, strong, mature households and leaders. 1 Timothy 3, 14-15 says how you should behave in the household of God, a family of families. So then you've got Timothy, which is the more complete treatment, just like you have Paul in the middle letters more complete. But Colossae kind of drives it into a network of churches, and Titus drives it in as an illustration because Titus, well, he left him in Crete that he would set in order what remains. So he's saying the churches aren't completely established. And so now we go, and that's a small new network. So now we put it in place so you can see it being finished, the process being finished to stabilize churches, and all of them, First Timothy and Titus, follow basically the same structure. Anyway, I won't say it again. Follow the same structure that the church is a family of families. So you have key eldership, you have a structure for widows and caring for them, older men, older women, younger men, younger women. It all is organized around that essence, but you also have to build the strong leadership. So 2 Timothy, then how do you develop intergenerational leadership, both amongst the churches and in individual families, intergenerational. Now, this is what's really, really important. Everything builds from this and the rest of the manual. At least the part that deals with Paul's letters, not the Gospels ones. So now you take the literary design, complex network establishing benchmarks, traditioning of Paul. So these are benchmarks for establishing a network of churches. And remember, one of the reasons why Paul was in so much conflict and with the Corinthian church, in 2 Corinthians, he says, you've got to correct these things. You've got to stay within my teaching, the traditioning that I've given to the churches. You've got to stay within it because I've been given a sphere. I've been given a field for this, taking the gospel to the Gentiles. And the churches are central to it. So we can't expand the field. He said, I'm expanding the field because that's my job with my apostolic team. But I can't expand it if key churches like yours become stupid, divided, and worthless. And he was so strong, he said, so if you don't stay within and I'm showing up next time with a big stick, you think I'm weak when I'm there, I won't be weak this time. You'll find out the power of my arguments. So, look at this for a moment. Now, the key to understand here is that once you've got the canonical framework and the intent of the books, when you get into each book, you've got to respect in the books are major literary sections. He's always integrative, so he's always building on stuff that build all the way through his letters. He's shifting in a canonical structure where you can see the process being established. But within the letters are literary sections that actually go after the main issue of teaching the sound doctrine or the establishing process of the churches. And so they become benchmarks. Like, for example, one benchmark that they've got the gospel is 1 Corinthians 15, 1-6, which is where he says, here's the gospel formulae, exactly like Peter's 5 sermons. And in essence, this is what he's doing with Galatians, because he's giving them the basic formula expanded a bit. Just like Mark gives you the basic gospel and Matthew expands it enormously, Galatians starts there and gives you the basic framework, but in the context of people deserting that core doctrine or that core gospel, but Romans stretches it out, just like Matthew stretches it out for Mark. The stuff is built beautifully and harmoniously, the canonical sections, if we put them in the right order. Then what's he doing in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? In 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, he talks about solid conversion. This is an amazing start. You need a solid conversion. And here's how I establish you. And when you're disestablished, reestablish. It's all right there. Then you go, so solid conversion, you've got to ask yourself the question, and you'll see when we get into the questions, how do you mark a solid conversion? So when I turn it into a question, you'll have the core topos there. Not just a question, but so you can quickly think whether they're established soundly or not. Now, when you come to 1 Corinthians, you've got now concerning, and then you've got a list of these schisms. Schisms in the community life, suing each other, etc., and schisms in the gathering. And so one of the things you've got to ask yourself the question is, are there any schisms emerging in the community life or the gathering? That's a benchmark. And if you say no, you got that benchmark. You're done. If you got two big schisms, you better get after them, because it'll eat away at the network. So they're benchmarks. The gathering topos, the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 11:17 to 14:40. Is it in place? And every conference, we wind up with the same conversation where some of you are saying, it doesn't fit the culture. What's really what they're saying is, to get this in place, I got to fight a fight, and I might lose people, and it's not worth it. That's what we're really saying on it. So right away you can say, I can look across the networks, and I can see that these 8 networks in China now that have said yes to our whole 10-year system, where they're going to now build deeply into the infrastructure of their whole network, all 8 of them have said yes and have begun implementing this. But it took a year-long battle to do that, starting with the fact that we're breaking up Holy Communion, this little 2-second time that replaces the meal. That even though they're house church networks, got rooted in the China church. I keep looking at Renton because Renton's translated for me on all of these hour-and-a-half sessions for 4 years, several hundred times. And so he's seen the battle in every church network because we cluster them together with the key leaders. And so their 2 big battles were this and apostolic teams and authority. That took another year to get that right. Perspective of ministry, conflicts without and fears within. So maybe your people and key leaders, some key churches in your hubs, decide that they want to become a mega church, just like the West, just like the big mega churches in the West. And therefore, if there's a lot of conflicts is a sign that the Spirit's not really working. You'd be conflict-free, and you'd have a big, successful church. Well, the reality here is conflicts without and fears within is how you view the ministry. And so you can go through all of these. I won't go through them all right now, but you can go through them all, and they become benchmarks. So then you have to say, now look at the passage in depth in 1 Corinthians 11:17 to 14:40. And as we do sessions going through that whole section, what questions do you ask yourself to make sure that you're assessing correctly of whether that's in place or not? I don't know if that's what comes next. So the topos of overall schemas are things like the gathering, the church as a family of families. The basic statements are a collection of principles. The statement summarizes a complex topic in the context of the schema. Household texts are another example of this. Husbands, wives, parents, children, master, slaves. 3 times. Husbands, wives, parents, children, master, slaves, essentially. 2 in Paul, and a similar one in following the same framework. But here you're dealing with a rough cultural situation with a lot of unbelieving husbands, but it's the same. Then there's these virtue lists that are all over a collection. They're paranetic, they're kind of an insert, and then you have the literary design shaped biblical theology of the books, like the section now concerning and the divisions in the churches. So in other words, you get the canonical framework, that's corpus linguistics, canonical framework. Then you get and in those sections you got the author's intent, and then you pay attention to the literary design. So the author is establishing his priority list. as it unfolds. It's not something we didn't go through and say, this is our inductive Bible study. This is the literary design, the priority list established by the author. Very important to understand this. Now, you go to 3 more glossary items. One is Hostenfeld, because, see, the reason why when you go into, you'll see this when you're in the process, but let's say, I say the organizing center is of the pastorals, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, is 1 Timothy 3, verses 14 and 15, and how you should conduct yourself in the household of God. Well, the reality is I have an entire doctrinal dissertation which is beautifully written establishing that point and how it fits the literary household structures of that day. When you go to 1 Thessalonians, Mallarby's book, a small one on pastoral care, the tradition of pastoral care, is carefully rooted in 1 Thessalonians. So you start with these major sections, actually, I don't need this slide right now. I need this one. Oh, I hate to skip over this stuff, but this is true all the way through the Bible. You get into Psalms, types of Psalms, the literary genre there. You've got several types of Psalms, but one is individual and community lament. That's actually, the individual lament is actually the grief process. When you look at all these Psalms that, that go through lamenting, confession, the grief with it, and the community ones as well. The wisdom literature, that's where all our life development stuff has come from, all built around the literary structures. The Gospels, same thing. The Gospel format, the bios, the life of the day, Greco-Roman lives is bios. And the Greek and the letters, Greco-Roman, topos, the stuff I've been taking you through here. These build your memory and the brain encoding so that you can think in chunks within the context of establishing churches, the process, and then get down to some detailed solutions in the particulars of many of the passages. Now, let's take, for example, so many other things to do, but let's take, for example, this is our assessment guide, and the assessment guide is in this session is in your book. But all the assessment guides and the sections that you match the books on, the sessions, and the glossary are all in your big guide. They're all in this book, but you pull them out and put them in a guide so you can use that to assess year by year where your churches are. So the network guide is drawn from Paul's early letters, the complex network assessment questions, the Thessalonian, or this first part of it, from Paul's early letters, Galatians, the Thessalonian correspondence, Corinthian letters, and Romans. So you ask yourself, you just put a little thing, the guide is built in so there's room for some notes in the margin. But not a lot of room, but some. But you got to go through this and you say, in your network, is it doing well? Are they doing well? Is there a slight problem or is there a major problem? The overarching topos of Paul's early letters are our churches and networks fully established in the gospel, marked by a solid conversion and by community-wide unity modeled in the weekly gathering. Are they marked by a full understanding of the gospel fought for by Paul in the Romans, and free from man-made traditions and consistent with the simple formula delivered by Paul to Jerusalem? So really, you've got Thessalonians, the network's established, you've got Thessalonians, you've got Corinthians in the weekly gathering, you've got a full treatment of the gospel and free from rules and regulations that are seen in Galatians. But now you go into each one. Same issue. Are there any signs of deserting the gospel in our churches, or more specifically, embracing another gospel that distorts the gospel, making it a different or altered form of the gospel? And then in our churches or networks, are there any who are true believers, but adding rules and regulations to the gospel, and thus causing the churches to embrace a gospel that is not pure as delivered by Paul. A third one, are our churches becoming solidly established in a new way of living, that's his terms in Galatians, according to a new set of first principles, producing a freedom from the law of the Old Testament and a lifestyle that demands we live by these principles as a rule of faith, laid out in Paul's teachings and letters as the new canon of faith. Do our churches and networks understand that walking by the Spirit is not a vague, mystical experience attained by some magical way, but rather ordering our lives around these new first principles and choosing to live them within the sphere of the Spirit? These are all terms that were used in Galatians. Sphere of the Spirit, which is set by these new teachings delivered by Paul as the rule of faith. Rule of faith is another term that's very much like the traditions. The rule of faith, the deposit, the sound doctrine. He's saying the same thing, that there's a body of truth delivered. And finally, do our churches respect the authorities appointed initially by the key leaders in the duly recognized gatherings, churches as leaders committed to guarding the gospel delivered by Paul in the context of living out the gospel in community? Now, if you've done your work in Galatians, you would see that these 5 statements are complex statements, but built around what Paul is arguing, even in his phraseology, as his argument unfolds in Galatians. So they're put into statement form, and you can say, well, yeah, boy, we just got a group of people that just won't respect the authority and keep adding to it, you know? So then what you do is you go from there, the Thessalonians, now I'm not going to, they're all in this book. Jeepers. Okay, now we're done. Now we're in the middle letters. Now we're in the later letters. Now what do? Now what you do is you say, you go back through all of that when you've read through all of them, and it demands, if you understand those statements that I've got written there, then you can't understand that statement unless you really are mastering that letter. But with that statement, and you do your own work, but you carefully go through it, you'll know that that's a complex statement. That's what we mean by topos. It's not just simple, a simple little topic listed. And so now if you check them and you say, okay, in session 3, walking by the Spirit, they don't walk by the Spirit because they're not ordering their lives around the teaching. And you take a lot of the radical global Pentecostals, for example. They got to go from experience to experience to experience in a magical, ecstatic way, which is why they were screwing up the gathering, you know, and the spectacular gifts being out of way. So then you go and you check this one to match the question, because they match the sessions all the way through. Now you're in a position of going to that session at least and doing your work within it. And ideally, you're going to have to do that before you've done this whole thing yourself. So, in Paul's traditioning process, what exactly do we mean by schematic for setting church networks in order according to Paul's traditioning process? How far does Paul's traditioning process extend beyond the broad schematic? Does it include principles, processes, practices, and church networks, regardless of the historical era? What are the key principles, processes, and practices to guide us in the establishing of churches and church networks? And how important is it that leaders regularly assess their churches and network and commit to establishing them according to this process? So then you've got a project in there, and our job isn't to do the projects and stuff at this time. The next session, we're going to look more in depth, I think it's the next session, at the actual process of building things like our pastoral care taxonomy, going from the schema to the principles, to the processes and practices, rather than jumping on over into the Western institutional psychological care, paradigm. Okay. I think we're done, aren't we? Is that Yeah, there's the project. I'm going to take us back just so I think the most important concept here, I'm going to put it on the screen, Michael, so you and I can refer to it. I think the most important concept is this.
Right there. Yep.
The benchmarks. And you know how much better this is than, let's say, you got somebody that writes a book, and these are the 8 keys to a healthy church. And somebody else writes a book, okay, now we're going to have healthy church time, and 4 or 5 others write. These are the 7 healthy church things. There's some truth. They draw stuff out, but they're man-made. This is the design. This is not man-made. The benchmarks it's kind of like in each one of these sessions, I think maybe there's a main one, but to me, just having done it again and read it 3 or 4 times, benchmarks seems to be a highly motivating concept. Anyway, what's your response from, I mean, how many times can you listen to this?
Well, that's the thing. You're always learning. You're always learning. We've got to have that posture, but because not only do we have to have it, it's because it's true. I mean, I could tell you learned in the last hour.
Yeah. Yep. I learn when I do acts I did it recently with Chinese leadership acts, which is book 2 in series 3 of the First Principles. Learned a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, I guess my first thought here is this is fun. This is exciting. You can get your hands around all of Paul's letters. Is that not exciting? You can it is possible. I think that part is that's the first reflection. The other thing, this particular slide, and I'll show you after our break some of my own process here to make sure that some personal aspects of how you need to be disciplined to master this. Because Jeff said a couple different times, you cannot establish your churches and you cannot establish your leaders unless you yourself are mastering Paul's letters. So you have to, if there's one thing you gather from this particular session is, you have to have a commitment to be mastering Paul's traditioning process. And as you're in the process of mastering Paul's traditioning from Christ, once you get to these benchmarks, which when Jeff says this is not man's, it's because, remember yesterday, I guess these are my reflections, out of the author's intent and his design and his arguments comes his topos, his core ideas, his collection, his constellation of arguments around organizing centers. And so you can then tell how we have to be establishing our churches. And so this is why, by the way, when you have things like this and when you're mastering it, this is why you can take, most churches never give time for questions because that's out of the worship paradigm idea. But when you take time for questions and you can answer literally hundreds, if not thousands of different questions, how can a person do that? Because you're walking around with this framework in your mind. And so anytime a person asks questions that's related to, and this has happened, as Jeff said, for years and years at this conference, and that is right now we're in an epoch of time where people are really struggling up the second curve, which is in the first part of it, is around the gathering. And so a lot of your questions, there's hundreds of questions about the gathering. But if you can put on the mind of Christ, you can answer hundreds of questions about the gathering because you have the overarching framework in your mind, and you can tie yourself to then the principles that support that framework. You following? So, I mean, those are things that I'm learning. Some of that is fresh, and some of that I'm just integrating now. But I think to summarize it, If you got to be able to walk around with this in your head as leaders, because that's then what you're going to pass on to your leaders and what the leaders are going to pass on to all the churches. Then we're actually carrying on the tradition. We're passing that tradition down rather than passing on a worship paradigm or a counseling paradigm or a youth group paradigm or you better call me pastor paradigm. All those things fit into this structure. There's one other thought I had, and that is some of you some of you, the way your environments are, you cannot listen for more than an hour and a half or 45 minutes. You're wired to just listen for about 30 minutes, and that's how your way of life is. So every year at the conference, I always, and every time I travel, I get jerked back to reality at times. With the rest of the cultures we'll carry on conversations. Acts 20, 7 through 16, where Paul and they had a dialogue on and on that went through the entire evening. A guy even fell out dead, and that didn't even stop him from talking. They raised him up from the dead, and then he continued on. For some reason in our cultures, you're used to only listening for 30 minutes, and then you feel like you gotta break. So we've been at it for 2 hours, I think, now. So you should be able to do it for 2 more hours, I think, before you're ready for a break. But I can tell that's not the case. You don't have that muscles, the muscles for that. So that's my encouragement, to build those muscles over time. Build those muscles at a time, because you always got to be integrating. And I can give you 5, 6 key things in your mind to be doing in order to help you stay focused and not let your mind and your body start wandering away. Because it's all about learning. It's all about... All right. With that said, we will take a break right now. But during the break, make it productive. I want you to be thinking about 1 or 2 things that you've learned in the last hour and a half, the last 2 hours. 1 or 2 things. And we'll hand the microphone back out when you come back from break, and just keep it that narrow, just 1 or 2 things you learned. Can we do that? Just be reflecting, talking to other people. What did you learn? Just a statement or 2. Make it a topos-based statement if you want. What you learned. Okay? All right, take a break. We'll come back in just a little while. 15 minutes. Let's make it 15 minutes of what we're going to try for. A thing that you've learned. So Zach's got the microphone. Let's hear from some of you. What did you learn in this session? It can be a very, very small thing or a big framework piece. Any of those are fine. Just any tidbit that you learned.
What did you know that became clear?
What did you know that became clearer? Somebody get us started right up here. Jorge. Yep, it's right. It's on.
Hello.
Yep.
Okay, let me see if I understood Jeff. I see a model
Donde el principio me guía al proceso.
where the principle guide me to the process.
El proceso me describe las prácticas
The process describes the practices,
y las prácticas me ayudan a establecer la iglesia.
and the practices help me establish the church.
Las iglesias bien establecidas permiten una expansión espontánea.
well-established churches allow for an spontaneous expansion,
donde me deja ver lo importante que es el proceso donde comienzo con el Master Craftsman,
where I can see how important it is, the process where I begin with the master craftsman.
me ayuda a identificar facilitadores
It helps me identify facilitators
que guían el proceso hacia la maestría de las Escrituras.
who guide the process into the mastering of scriptures.
Es clave el trabajo serio de los líderes
The serious work of the leaders is key,
y la evaluación permite ver la calidad del proceso de establecimiento.
and the assessment allows us to see the quality of the establishing process.
My goodness.
Very good.
Wow.
Yeah.
That Jorge should have done session 3.
Yeah, I love especially that last line, that it's really true. That's why those are not just simple statements, they're topos statements that allows you to assess the quality of the establishing process.
Yeah, and that was so good, Jorge. That is so encouraging because you recalled. Let me just add just a bit to it. It's the schema, which is the broadest framework pieces. So that's the canonical. These three together is Paul's corpus, a canonical piece, and then down to the principles. One layer down from that is principles that help undergird that. Principles as opposed to rules. Not rules. We're going to talk about this in session 5. And then there's processes that help undergird those principles in our churches and in our networks and as leaders. And then there's practices. There's not a lot of practices. There's a significantly less practices. And that's all that framework of a schema, principles, processes, and practices is in contrast to rules, policies, procedures, other secondary traditions of man that we've made through the years of denominations and Protestantism and all the different flavors. That's in opposition to that. Because most denominations, their unity is in their disunity. Because they've split off because they believe this about baptism, and now they're going to put their arms around everybody who believes that doctrine around baptism. So you got to get back to Paul's schema. That's wonderful, Jorge. That's a great example. What else? Steve, right here.
Yeah, Jeff, as you're talking, especially at this chart, a passage that I've long been challenged by, but also used to challenge others, is at the end of Romans. Paul has this statement that we're often fond of because Albania has mentioned it: from Jerusalem to Illyricum, I've accomplished the work. It says down later in 23, there's no more work for me in these regions. And you just have to ask yourself, what in the world is Paul talking about, you know? And then he's clearly working with the Roman church. Now I can come to you, be refreshed with you a little while. You've gotten this, full treatise of my gospel. You're a new Antioch, so we can go to Spain. This stuff was very, very real in Paul's mind, down at the smallest level, all the way across a network that spanned from Jerusalem all the way to the Western Adriatic. And now he's going to do the same it's concrete and real. In Paul's mind, this tradition was operating and was there and was enough, that he could vision going to the end of the world. And he, that's what he was doing. So these aren't just ideas. This was actually happening, and we have Paul's own words reinforcing it. And the vision to do that can get all the way down to the granular level of these things. It all works together. It's all one thing. It's all one aspen grove. It's all one, living organism. Very encouraging to have that point strengthened again, and see it, in light of Paul's statement there.
Yeah. Great, Steve. I don't know your name, but right up here, the doctor from Cuba. David.
Yes.
That doesn't sound like a Spanish name.
David.
David. What was I thinking? Yeah.
Thank you.
My bad. My bad.
My name is David. I am living now in San Jose, California, but I born in Cuba and I worked with Jorge almost 10 years under this paradigm. When I have almost maybe 18 questions for you, but the first is my main question because when I study from the chapter 1 to chapter 5, thank you for this job. It's amazing. It's one line. You increase the idea about what is the process in the next year. I love it when you make the goals and the process for the next generation of the orchard. But now in my mind, we are in a very important moment.
Okay.
We have two options. The first is to try to adapt the philosophy of Bill to the Western paradigm, to the institutional church who are in crisis, and it's try to the union between two different paradigms.
Taino, who? What?
To the union,
What is that word?
unify.
Try to unify both. Okay,
Yeah.
keep going. Good.
I don't like that way.
You don't like that option?
No.
All
no.
right.
The second way is the second option is to do our theology in the culture and lead charismatic church movement in our community. And we are working in that. But I have a question because some years ago, the main challenge was teach the people to understand the new paradigm. But now we have organic church in our home, in our neighborhood, with the possibility to create a new church and good leaders who born it under this system. In your main, what is your advice for, because if the network continue growing, we will face with some problem or obstacles, or what is your advice for this moment when we are living now?
Okay. So you're saying, let me try to clarify let's just recall what you said. You said there's two options. You can take the Way of Christ and His Apostles paradigm and try to mix it in with the West, and you said you don't think that's a good idea. Then you said you have another option, and that is to just take the paradigm, and you added to that you've started with some simple churches now, or some churches that meet in households or something?
We have churches, charismatic churches in houses,
Yep.
in Cuba,
In Cuba,
in
in San
California,
Jose. Okay.
now I'm with my brother in Florida.
Now your brother in Florida.
Yeah.
Okay.
The paradigm work. Yeah, we have results.
Okay, and the paradigm works.
Yeah.
But what is your advice? You said that word 3 times, right? What is your advice?
Yeah. If we continue working on that under this season, Paul fight versus some problem with the youth community from. You are. Es decir, ellos están muchos años por delante de nosotros. ¿Qué problemas nosotros podemos enfrentar que pueden obstacularizar nuestro movimiento?
So it's just envisioning that, since you are many years ahead of us, which are some problems or issues that we're going to find that will be an obstacle for the development of our process.
Okay, so I think I think I understand the question, and that is, what do we do next, or what pitfalls are ahead of us? My first response actually is, keep going. Just keep going, because you got a good start. The second part of an answer would be is you really do need to begin to you got to master the first principles, and you got to master God's story, yourself and as leaders. And as you're doing that, then you got to start diving in to your own mastery of the scriptures. Now, I'm using that as a directive, not as a title of a series. But these benchmarks, I think, will actually tell you what's ahead of you. You're going to have schisms. And you're going to have schisms likely around the gathering if you pull in people that have been church before. And so Paul gives you, I think, and you're going to have to solidly establish people in the gospel. And that's not just we all are in a lifelong process in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, a lifelong process of conversion. Now, it's been taught like there's a singular moment in salvific baptism, and you get into all these other doctrinal arguments and secondary traditions. But Paul is talking about that we're all in a process of putting off the old and putting on the new, and that's a frame of mind that you're going to have to help your people understand that there are moments, nodal moments of accepting the gospel. But it's a lifelong process. And that's within view, and not in this screen, but
I changed it.
in the whole benchmark of Paul's letters. So you're gonna, in simplistic form, I would say you're gonna have to begin to understand how to yourself and your leaders how to master the scriptures, starting with Paul.
You know what? It's a common question to ask. Am I on?
Yep.
It's a common question to ask what's next, because once you want to do priority, you want to give priority to what's next, you know. And but you're right, Micah. It's a complex answer. In one sense, what's next is you study the first ones, early letters. So you can to get your ordered establishing there. But I think what's next, you have to figure out what's next. There is no next. You have to figure out what's next. So how do you do that? That's the value of these questions. See, these questions, even if you don't know Galatians, I've written these questions so carefully that you know the first part of Galatians with this question. It's clear enough. These are questions that are topos. I take the topos statement. So let's say that the argument is moving through Galatians, and one of the arguments, when you get to about the third session, is are they putting rules and regulations in? And then the next one is, do they know how to walk by the Spirit? So if you just say a question, can they walk by the Spirit? You don't know what the heck that means. You know, generally, to most Pentecostals and to the Christian life books I've read, being controlled by the Spirit is like flicking on a light switch. So you go, flick it on, go, control me. I mean, what's it mean? Well, when you get into Galatians, if you look here, trigger happy. Do our churches and church networks understand that walking by the Spirit is not a vague mystical experience attained in some magical way, but rather the ordering of our lives around the new first principles and choosing to live within the sphere of the Spirit, which is set by these new teachings being delivered by Paul as the rule of faith. So in Galatians, he uses rule of faith, he uses sphere of the Spirit, and he uses parapateo, which was walk amongst those principles in the Spirit sphere. And you'll be increasingly controlled by the Spirit, not on off, now I'm not in the Spirit, now I'm in the Spirit. It's are you in the sphere that the Spirit is developing and maturing, so you're walking around. You see, so when you actually read these three questions together, it's not like, are you controlled by the Spirit? You know what they mean, and you know what's in Galatians just by the questions.
Hopefully when you leave, the thing, this tool here, this bigger tool, has all of those questions and all of this in there. We hope that if you're going to leave here, one thing we would hope we equip you with is know how to use these questions in here. Because to Jeff's point here, you're the engine. You're the engine to this car. We can give you the framework pieces of this car and all that, but it's your field. And it's your team and it's your field, it's your work, it's your churches, and you've got to deal with the complexity. Especially, you should keep planting more churches, because as you plant more churches, you're going to have more. As I think what you said is, as we expand, we're going to have more problems. Yeah, all the people you add, you're going to bring all their problems, they bring all their problems with them. So I think pragmatically, the best, if you leave here and you can understand the significance of these questions that this chart is based
They're
on,
gone.
you're on the wrong slide
Yeah.
again. If you can understand that, I think then you've made progress this week.
So probably what's next, there are probably 2 or 3 things that are next. So if you start here and just go down this, and it's just a frame, but then you say there's a couple of them that really stand out, like there's no elders, deacons, and leading women recognized. Then what you can, so then you go to you go to the book. I mean, so those 3 are the later letters, so you got to go to the sections, to the questions of those later letters and go through them, and then mark out the session that you want to go to begin building a base in your own thinking. But for what's next, though, the point is, are there any big problems or slight problems, and prioritize the big ones, and then go to the questions related to that. So you can go to the sessions related in Corinthians, related to those now concerning. And so I have that in a session where those problems are there. You can go to, so I mean, it's like bing, bing. There's 2 things that are really key. So then you got to go there and ask the very careful questions, and then identify a couple sessions and work on that. But when you're done with it, you've done this whole process, you're gonna instinctively know what's next. I guarantee you. You will, and that's part of the answer, Bill, to those 2 sections you were talking about. I know those are accurate because I've gone back over them, but instinctively I just wrote them. And you'll develop that.
You'll build the mind of Christ.
And
You'll build
explain,
Paul's
Michael,
tradition.
explain, because I hadn't tied it to this, but it's really important to the process you're in, that we're taking you through right now, that your Bloom's taxonomy example of barely recalling versus where we want them, because we want you at the top level of Bloom's taxonomy. That's what this will produce.
So Bloom's taxonomy, let's just show that so you know. Those are great insights and great learnings. Let me.
Do you think you can turn right to that?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. I would put a wager on this one.
What? How come it won't let me share? This Apple AirPlay, I'll tell you.
Put the right one up too, the color one that.
That's right, that's the one. I don't know where it's going. Apple AirPlay is a joke at times. I don't know. Is it there? On my end now it says it's there. There we go. So where is the picture though? That's the picture I want. My goodness. Okay, finally. So
Yeah, I like this one.
what we were just in the S-curve paper, I have 3 questions, 3 sets of questions, and what the 3 sets of questions are attempting to do with everyone is move you from understanding and remembering up to applying and analyzing, and then the 3rd set of questions around creating and evaluating. What we're answering your question with is we want you to use all of the whole New Testament to answer the question about what's next. That's the answer from a master craftsman point of view. However, problem is we're not at that, you're not at that spot. Collectively, we're not at that spot. That's creating and evaluating. This is an evaluation assessment tool. But what I asked you to do during break is simply to tell us one thing that you've learned. And that's the understanding part and recall part here. And that's the way all this learning starts. Anything you're learning new, always. So that's the point of the question was, what's one thing that you've learned? So we're starting here, but we want you to be moving up. And it takes a while. Like we said, be patient. We've been working with this for 10 years at some level. You've heard us, we've taught on individual books. I did 3 sessions out of the book of John, remember, in 2018.
Now, don't wreck
Remember
my
that?
boxes. Those boxes are he has a set and I have a set. They're the only ones that
And these are
exist.
his-
But
this
they're
is his
just
set.
constructed for us.
These are his
And they're
sets,
not
so
very
I can-
strong, and he's leaning on my boxes, not his boxes. That's what the problem is here.
Right here, Zach. Am I right? Were you a doctor in Cuba? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So you are an accomplished
Check,
learner,
yeah.
a master craftsman.
So, putting all this together, this looks like an enterprise diagnostic tool, like an MRI. And when we do the assessment, we get the report. And with the report, you can get a prescription and then go to the pharmacy and buy a medicine. Something like that. It looks
Okay.
like that.
yeah.
That's
I
what
think
you're learning. Yeah. I'll put up a,
When you're done with this, go back to Bloom's taxonomy. I want to make a couple points on it. What's that?
well, that's the same chart we had up just a moment ago.
Oh,
The
that's
tradition
chart.
of Paul.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay, you want to go to Bloom's?
This, well, this is,
So what this
Really
is,
good.
let me just explain what this is. Yeah, I guess I got pulled into it now. What this is what I do, and for all of us need to be moving up Bloom's taxonomy and master these things. So what I do is I have I'll just show you my short little process here. I have a tool that I use here, but let me go to Mastering the Scriptures, and I have Teaching Mastering the Scriptures here, and I have all my notes that I take. These are all my notes that I take. And then the next thing I do is I actually try to visualize it. So I take session 3 right here, which is what we just got done doing, Paul's traditioning process, setting church networks in order, and I try to make my own sense of it, I draw my own stuff so that I can remember it. I put little pictures by it because I like charts and graphs, and that's the next thing. This is my first draft after my notes. So I've got my notes, so I've listened really actively, which I can give you a whole bunch of active listening skills that can engage you for hours. But I'll save that for another day. Then you take your own notes. Another time, you just take your notes. And then the next process I have is I visualize it like this. So Jeff was saying, let me make it bigger here. He was saying Paul was passing on a tradition. He used 1 Corinthians 11, 2, 17, 23, 2 Thess, 1 Corinth. The tradition was from Christ and the other apostles, and we're supposed to pass it down. Now, we can try to pass down other cultural things and all these other things, but the fact is we are responsible. This is what I was challenging some of you yesterday morning around. You're responsible for passing down the tradition. You can make all sorts of excuses why your culture can't take it, but that was predicted. So, to me, that's a quick little visual. The next thing we talked about was the Greek rhetorical schematic, topos and topai. And so there's this whole cluster of ideas. It's not just a single, let's use this for marriage passage. It's a whole collection of ideas with an organizing center. And so that's when you then get over to here to Paul's topos schema is his collection of letters. So early letters, middle letters, later letters, to give us strength in the gospel charisma, the mission and vision of the church, and the mature households and leaders. And the organizing centers of that topos is Romans 16, Ephesians 3, and 1 Timothy 3. And Ephesians 3, 8 to 10, that we just mentioned as the organizing center of the middle letters, it was Christ's strategy of how to administrate the plan. And then we get 1 Timothy 3, that the plan is that God's church is a household. Well, he uses the word oikois there, and he uses the word oikonomo for grand strategy. They're in the same family. You should see how those ideas now are connected to the constellation of ideas. So if you just read that passage on its own, you're like, oh, that has nothing to do with 1 Timothy 3. It got nothing to do with it. No, it has everything to do with it if you're thinking in this way, if you're putting on the mind of Christ and integrating it all together all the time. But again, you got to start with the whole framework. So then Jeff had 5 schemas, types of schemas to help determine, assist in memory, but also help when you're reading. And then, of course, the core chart was the core chart that we've been showing is the benchmarking of Paul's traditioning process with his early, middle, and later letters, which is the chart we keep showing.
Now put the Bloom's taxonomy back on, because I want to use this,
So-
what you just did, to put it on.
Okay.
See, if you look at this, recalling facts, understand, applying it, what Michael's beginning to do with his charts are analyze and evaluate. In other words, you're actually showing the integration to yourself.
Yep.
You know, so it's one thing to remember it, to understand the idea, and to apply it individually in situation. It's another to draw connections of the ideas. Well, in my works, I draw connections to the ideas, but you're putting those connections into visual and your own words. Then out of that, we create.
Out of
At the very
this,
top.
I create S-curve papers. I create gatherings as church papers, and then I use some of these charts in there.
So
Because-
Michael,
Yep.
you created a work, if you go back to his intergenerational one, because he's thought these things through, then you come to the conflict with the foundation and the whole issue of 2 kinds of boards, in it. And that paper is a creation at that top level.
It's no theology of Paul, but it solves a problem that we're dealing with that's right in front of us of what's next kind of thing. There's a parenting paper we've done. I've done a board paper, because Western boards versus Paul and his team, gathering as church, because so many people get...
And so why is that important? Well, we have to be one-minded as a church, both the apostolic team and at least our senior elders. We got to understand this, because a big decision is being made, that affects our direction. So the paper does that. We have to be able to articulate and defend it. And so when you go up and down Bloom's taxonomy, the reason why all this stuff is written is so you can create at the top. And you say, is that really a biblical thing? Well, that's exactly what Titus said. Make sure when you appoint elders, they're good character, good family, etc. They have a firm grasp of the teaching, and they can teach and refute those who contradict. In a small house church, in a conversational style, you have to be able to not only understand the ideas, communicate them very clearly, but win the debate. And you can't win the debate unless you're functioning at 3, 4, and 5 level in the academy. So that's why everything's structured the way it is, and why you have to do your own work.
Yep. I remember growing up, I always got to insert these stories in, but we need to hear from you. But anybody else? Thinegren? As you're walking there, when I grew up, I remember having one of the elders got kicked off because he got divorced, and that was a rule. Can't be divorced. And then we had hold on, Felix. And then we had a guy that took his position that had no idea where 2 Timothy was. Had no idea where 2 Timothy was as an elder. So how is he going to shepherd the churches? He didn't know anything, but he wasn't divorced. So that's better. So you just see how we make these rules over here versus the principles and processes of Paul, and then we just get all twisted up, and it just continues a cycle of very shallow Christianity. Felix, Edward, go ahead.
In the morning session, Jeff was referring to the flexibility of Paul's traditions. There is a flexibility. Can you throw more light on that?
Actually, in next session, we're going to do some. on that. But if you go into, how do I get back my thing back?
Mike will bring us back to you.
What's that?
Mike will bring us back to
Oh,
the
okay.
different input. Felix, you're supposed to tell us what you learned, though. You're not supposed to pull us into a 10-minute answer. What's one thing you recalled and remembered?
What's this the first thing?
The flexibility.
Yeah.
Paul deals with slavery, and we're going to talk about that next. How to do theology and culture inside of Christ's grand strategy. And that'll show you the flexibility in there.
Yeah, I guess this doesn't illustrate what I wanted. The section where I really deal with that, or where Paul deals with it, is in 1 Corinthians, the second session. Because what he does is he handles a set of community problems, suing each other, what about marriage, and if someone's divorced, he goes through, those things. And in it, he has a set of phrases that's extremely interesting. This is from the Lord. This is what I think is from the Lord. This is from me, but I'm pretty,
I'm pretty strong on it,
Yeah,
but it's still my opinion.
there's four, I think it's 4 different ways he talks. But the point behind the whole thing is to recognize that there's a framework, but that framework is done in such a way, the schemas and the principles, in such a way that you have to create processes and practices in your own cultural situation. Because it's interesting how many processes and practices really aren't there in terms of carrying out ministry. But if you understand the schema and the framework, and any essential processes and practices, what we're going to deal with in the next session. But if you understand the schema and if you understand the principles behind it, there's an enormous amount of flexibility.
Yeah.
Enormous amount of flexibility. But you kind of got to develop the mental acumen like Paul to be able to say, this is clear, pretty sure this is clear, but as a wise leader, I really do think this. So so learning the framework, the principles, the kerygma, the didache is one thing, but learning how to assess a situation and understand the flexibility and freedom within it without moving outside the framework and the principles is I think why all these letters are situational. Because this is a situation, and in it you can see the big picture, the things that have to be established in all the churches, but you can see Paul work flexibly. And that's what I really like. So I guess we'll get into it more the next session, more of the flexibility. But you got to understand that idea exists. And what denominations do is they take the flexible things and turn them into rules. So 10% of the foundation now becomes 40% rules, and you lose the capacity to reason.
When you say there is flexibility, there is a potential danger of entering false doctrines into the. People may take this as a excuse to introduce false doctrines, interpretation.
I didn't follow that.
I'm tempted not to let you keep asking questions because I want to do what you're learning. What have you learned from session 3, Felix? Can I put you on the spot that way? I mean, those are good questions, but
There is a possibility of a false doctrine entering because there is a flexibility in Paul's traditions. That's why clarification just.
So you're asking the question because you learned the idea of flexibility
I think
in doing theology.
That's
and
what I
culture.
hear too. That is good because I think the more you understand that you tie yourself to the schema, the framework, you can be extremely flexible. In fact, this framework can work in every culture and every time until Christ comes back. And so there's got to be, but it doesn't mean it's just everywhere and we can do whatever we want. There is still a way. There's still a tradition that's passed on. So I think wrestling with that is a good thing to wrestle with, because there are some core principles you have to also tie yourself to underneath that schema that will help you work things out in your culture and in your specific situation. Okay, a couple others. What are you learning? Then right over here. Hurry up, Zach. Make it rain. That means like run. Oh, yeah, or Finnegan right here. I guess keep your hand raised so Zach knows who you are.
Check. I heard you clearly, repeatedly were prophesying that if you do not master the scriptures in the way of Christ and apostles, particularly in the corpus of Pauline, we will, rather than commonizing that extent, I will end up with the big danger of jeopardizing the churches in a psychological, clinical paradigm. So far, I was thinking that we may end up with a traditional paradigm of the systematic theology, but there's another danger over here, that another set of authority coming, like encyclical 6. It's a very, very serious issue. There will be another set of theology, another set of kerygma, and another set of traditions. And we may enjoy over right now and just assessing everything a slight problem, but it's not a slight problem. It's a major problem. I learn, I must learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there are so many things. See, in the U.S., the churches are so disestablished, so unestablished, and they're not prepared to equip people. They're not prepared to really train leaders. So all these outside entities try to build an organization for the solution. And one of them is Christian psychiatry and psychology. And obviously we have to interact with the medical world so we don't disassociate, but who's driving the bus? Because if you take outside entities that are given to an unestablished church, they will drive the bus. And the elders have to drive the bus. They have to shape the direction of it with the apostolic, leaders. But we have to build things consistent with, and because you need to build some processes and practices for counseling and shepherding that move across your network, and some things that you're going to share in common, and they're in that category. You'll see it in the next session. But if you screw up, you build everything else right, but you screw up and bring some of those in, it's and through the years, as we were building these things, I always got the criticism, and if Jeff didn't do it, he won't let anything in from the outside. I wouldn't let anything in from the outside while we're building the paradigm that's in another paradigm. Why would you do that? And so when you're building it, you look narrow. But when you do it and it works, it's
Then you're able to go across all cultures in any place in the world, and because you're carrying Paul's traditioning process. I mean, that's where the whole flexibility comes in. Pragmatically, let me tell you something else. Give me your book again. Why are you taking your book from me?
We could make arrangement for you to have your own set.
Yeah, you know what we need to do? We need to put a piece of tape across this table, right down the middle. That would be a good rule. We don't operate by rules around here. But what was I going to say? When I travel, I carry this thing along with me. And when I'm in a situation, often what I do in the evenings when I go back is I often look at this and I do a quick assessment of either the leader I'm with, the set of leaders I'm with, the church network I'm with, or even wider, the whole civilization maybe I'm looking at. So I'm looking at it all 4 or 5 different levels, and I look at it, and I'll mark which ones that are a problem. And I'll refresh myself. I'll go back in and go look at my own work and say, oh yeah, they're not passing on the tradition. In fact, they don't even know if there is a tradition. So anyway, I just want to give you, once you know how to use this, you can use this in your situation. Use it in your situation and do what I just said. It's a way to help discipline yourself to always be learning, because I'm learning because I gotta remind myself of this portion. Or for you've never used this, or you never used this portion in 2 Timothy. And so it'll be a guide for you. That would be the challenge. In this year ahead, do that. You go home and after you meet with a leader, do a little assessment. And then find where they're weak and tie yourself back to the principles in the text.
A really funny story, quick. I'm Michael's in India when you guys all had your last graduation.
Celebration.
What is it?
Celebration, not a graduation.
Yeah, what am I thinking?
That's
Celebration.
so old paradigm. Go ahead.
Well, that's fair. So I'm in China, and I get this email.
Oh yeah.
And saying, will you put together a video greeting for those that are celebrating their graduation?
Their celebration.
That are celebrating. And, you don't like to, it's really hard to stop when you're into something and do something, that's going to be worth it. So I asked him, I says, what do you want me to say? And instead of texting me back, what do you want me to say? He said, man, I'm carrying this thing everywhere. I'm realizing how powerful it is. He didn't give me anything about, what he wanted me to say or anything
I gave you
that.
like 4 paragraphs of what I'm learning, though.
Yeah.
And I thought that would be a really good encouragement. That's our story. So
Nobody's
laughing at our
entertained
interchanges.
by it as we are.
We are not going to show our text message threads through the years, last 10 years, though. That might be a little. Sometimes we say other things to each other.
Did I tell you about the time I captured that Tasmanian devil?
Yeah, I heard about that. About when you hurt your leg because you saved all those young children from that rabid dog?
Yep.
Yeah, I've heard that story. I'll text you about it later. One other. Let's do one more. This is good. Let's keep the flame of intelligence right over here. Tom.
So I'm looking at the title to the chapter, and then I'm looking at the benchmarks, and I'm looking at the framework, and then these are benchmarks of the framework, and I see and value and have learned more, so I can see more clearly the framework to guide me in assessing and fully rooting churches. But I don't see in the benchmarks as clear or bringing clarity for me fully rooting networks. Is it only through the rooting of the churches that I am, or am I missing something in terms of the benchmarks for rooting the network, my network?
Actually, that part that you were excited about and that Bill just asked me about, there's 2 levels to the answer. One is in session 5, there's what was Paul's reasoning of why he did some of the things he did next, and what's the other category his list of problems.
His leadership decisions he made in order to build the network, that's based on these benchmarks, which is another chart. But you can get there almost on your own once you're quasi-mastered these benchmarks. But nevertheless, it's in session 5. And then out of that, you also get, the second thing is you get Paul's network acumen, Paul's skills. Just like when you read, you have to have skills. Just like when you're sitting there and listening, you have to have, there's a whole bunch of skills that go with listening. But also with building a complex network of churches, there's some skills that Paul shows us he developed. And you see that interweaved through his letters. And those are based on the benchmarks. I have them on the chart here, but what are you looking? Are you looking for it?
Well, what I was going to do was say down here in the middle is the,
So, yeah, this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but in session 5, Paul's letters as tools for building complex apostolic networks. So the actual session itself is your question. So you've demonstrated right there that you're with us on session 3. So that's perfect. And you're already now thinking, okay, this is great for churches, but what about churches of churches and churches, more churches?
but one of the things.
So we'll get to this chart.
Put my chart back up, or the benchmark one.
This is like the Holy Spirit. You just flip a switch. Boop. That was a terrible
See, one
joke.
of the things
Terrible. Terrible.
is very important here is in building the network, Paul gives us a lot of text on network building. And so I made sure at the end the end of every letter that you'll see network stuff in it. Because like take 1 Corinthians 16 is all his explanation of his network. He's sending Phoebe up, here's these churches, greet these, here's who I want. And
He's
then
directing.
all of Romans 16, the end of a number of the letters. But then also the network churches, Ephesus being a hub, Lycus Valley being a cluster, Philippi a strategic partner. I have a whole section in there on his comments and clues about using them, in building the network. So you say, why in the world would he spend all this time, Romans 16 and 1 Corinthians 16? That's a lot of territory. And then when you realize that actually 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are network building, and 2 Timothy is network building, as he talks about how to move ahead. So you get the establishing in it, but if you just take all of those sections, 1 Corinthians 16, Romans 16, sometimes it's 8-10 verses, at the end of the letters, and you just put them all together, you got an enormous amount of information about the processes. And I think Bill was asking the question when we get to session 5. I do this thing, or what are Paul's decisions that he needed to make? And then I clustered the list of problems, early, middle, later letters, and the decisions he made. Because he made some strategic decisions. Like one of the decisions is why did he leave an open door for the gospel in 1 Corinthians 2:12-14? Because he hadn't heard from
Epaphroditus?
Titus.
Titus?
And so then he leaves that wide open door for the gospel. You can see the strategic decisions that are made. And my answer to Bill was some of it is just instinctive, but I think when I go to the question of what really underlies them, I think they're embedded in all this material that he's talking about how he's building the network and greeting this church and listen to Phoebe for this. And I sent Timothy down there with this letter to establish you. I mean, so you actually see him establishing churches, but that's almost always in the context of the network that he was building. So that material is vital material.
The multiplication or fulfilling the Great Commission is a multiplication of churches.
And that's an example of learning, because see, I just put that together, but we were very careful to develop all the network pieces at the end of the letters. And
that are networks. Yeah, you can't just have individual churches out there and and they're just out on their own. I mean, that's like leaving a babe alongside the road. They need a family to be part of. They need clusters and hubs. They need apostolic type leaders and teams that stirs amongst them, and they need local elders who know what they're doing and who are also trying to mastering the scriptures in order to shepherd them and care for them. Leaders locally and leaders that stir amongst the network. It's two basic teams. Anything else? This has been good. I was hoping to have a little bit of time for you to actually do an assessment just on Galatians. Just use the 5 ones on Galatians and just do it for your own situations. But I think we'll save that for maybe this afternoon if it works, or maybe tomorrow. We'll see how things unfold. Any other recall or remembering things that you've learned? I want to give ample opportunity. You learn best by these things by saying it in your own words. No? Okay, we'll come back at 1:30 and we'll do session 4.